Professor Pytlik, it is such a pleasure to have you on our show today. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. During the recent conflict between Israel and Gaza, and there were, of course, a few incidents of street fighting within Israel between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, I went on a social media app called Clubhouse, and I listened to Palestinian and Israelis talk to each other freely and very quiet, respectfully. It was refreshing. I love listening to them. They were saying something that was really interesting. They said, historically speaking, we're like cousins, that we have more in common than many other religions. Professor Pytlik, in the context of history, what are they referring to? That Israel, Jews and Muslims having things in common, being like cousins? What is that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me, by the way. And
My
yes,
pleasure.
true. It's something that has been forgotten that we need to remember. That there has been long periods of time when Jews, Muslims lived together, debated peacefully religious issues, worked together, worked towards the good of a common society, such as in the Ottoman Empire and other places. And they share a common ancestry as far as the religion goes, and as far as how they emerged as people into the world in history.
What do you mean by
They have
common
this
ancestor?
Well, at least religiously, this comes from the founder of Abraham and the stories associated with Abraham, and also the fact that many of the same stories are found in Judaism and in Islam, with a little different inflection culturally or something like this. So they do have these common stories. This is really an important part of interfaith dialogue. I think that people sometimes don't realize goes on. In the United States, for example, a few years ago, I was one of several on a committee in the reform movement here in the Detroit area to speak to the Muslim community here. And we had set up a number of different meetings and discussions about common topics like Abraham, like common stories. And these are where we found that the most interest and the most conversation was about how we have taken similar stories and developed them slightly different. They have different meanings in some cases, but they are common. They are common stories. So we come from the same background that way.
How did stories about Judaism or Jewish people make it into Muslim teachings?
Well, Muhammad himself and the Quran itself says that that Muslims should take into consideration and respect the people of the book in general. So that that's built into Islam as well, where we need to look at the stories that came before, before Islam was actually a world religion, and respect those stories and respect those people that were important to those other traditions. I'm speaking now just about Judaism, but Christianity has a role here too. But such, for example, that Moses was a prophet, and David is considered to be a prophet, and Solomon is considered to be an important person.
Wait, these are in the Quran?
It's in the Quran indirectly that these are these figures and Judaism itself, as the people of the book, need to be respected, protected. Of course, Islam has a new dispensation. It is trying to make a new world religion. So while it incorporates some of this older material, Muhammad, of course, is the final prophet according to Islam. And of course, there's a new religious tradition that is accepted. But the core foundation of this is we are speaking to the same family, more or less.
Interesting. So when you say Islam is forming a new religion, you're referring back to, I don't know the exact years, the 7th century, 630s, 640s, whatever that era is.
Sure.
This is Muslim prophet Muhammad. Is it interacting with Jewish scholars and religious people and learning about Judaism?
Well, from where he came, he emerged out of the Arabian Peninsula, and the rise of Islam as a world religion is coupled with political ambition. So
Yes.
there's no hiding the fact that it is also they're conquering territory as they go. So right from the start, Islam is not only religion, but it's closely tied to the political sphere as well. That's just built into Islam. So this expansion out of Arabia follows the experience Muhammad had with the people living in the peninsula. So before Islam, there were local tribes, for example, polytheists, as we were told. And there were also Jews living in decent numbers in Mecca, Medina, and in the peninsula itself. So yes, there was quite a bit of back and forth about what was going on in Judaism. And of course, the stories were probably pretty well known. You have to look back at this as a situation that if you're trying to create a new religion, if that's the intent of Muhammad at this time, if you're trying to create a new religion, how do you influence people to think about this new religion? And one of the ways that he had to take into consideration was the Jewish tradition, which had been long established by that point, even in the Arabian Peninsula. So yes, the earliest sort of rituals associated, for what we know anyway, with Islam is like the direction of prayer, for example, was originally Mecca and Jerusalem. So one could orient oneself towards Jerusalem. And this took time to sort of change. You can read into this that some early Muslim or Islamic traditions are very much appreciative of the precedent set by Judaism. So we have the idea of looking towards Jerusalem. Why is that the case? Well, after Muhammad makes his flight to Medina, there are other stories.
I'm sorry, his flight?
Well, his migration, it's called. He's leaving.
Is this a mental?
No. We'll get to that one in a minute. But he was born in Mecca.
Okay.
And then there is a revelation to Muhammad from Allah around about 610 or so in Mecca. And he recognizes the older religions. They're recognized as important prophets: Jesus, David, as I said, David, Solomon, Moses.
And Muhammad is advocating monotheism, so I could see that relation and attraction to Judaism, which is another monotheistic and long-established religion. I see. Okay, so as you said, a monotheistic faith with Muhammad as the final prophet. So there are some significant differences theologically with Judaism and Islam and Christianity as the sort of the other religion here. But let's keep on track to this. Of course.
When Muhammad has his mystical journey, he goes from Mecca to Jerusalem, is known as famously in Islam as the night flight. And when it goes from Mecca to Jerusalem, you can read it as a mystical journey, or you can read it as a physical journey. Either way, it's to the farthest mosque. That is taken to be Jerusalem. So early on, it's cemented in this the sweeping idea of taking Judaism and the history and tying it to Jerusalem. That is a very important holy spot for Islam. Of course, it's the most holy spot for Judaism. And where does he go in this journey? Physical or mystical or both? He stopped at the bedrock on Mount Zion. This is the location of the first and second temples within Jewish tradition. It's also the site where effective rulers ruled: David, Solomon. They're seen as ideal kings, even within Islam. So this is an important step. It's tying the political with the religious and tying the history together. Now it can go forward as something new. There's a new idea. Where does Muhammad go after he reaches this important spot for Judaism, the bedrock Mount Zion in Jerusalem? He goes on a journey through the seven heavens. And there along the way, he meets all of the previous dispensations, like the prophets. He meets Moses, David, Jesus is there, and others. And he goes up and he goes through the seven heavens. And you can read this all the way back to how the Greeks had an idea of the seven heavens and how Aristotle and other Greek philosophers influenced Islam. It's a Hellenized religion as well. So we have these wonderful traditions. Now, that doesn't mean the Arabian Peninsula is left behind. Muhammad faced opposition. There's no doubt about that. So when he fled Mecca, he went to Medina in 622. And when he moved in that direction to escape the persecution in Mecca, he's tried to found a theocratic state there as well. So it's year one of the Muslim calendar. So it's not easy.
Wow, so it's that significant that migration from Mecca to Medina actually starts the Muslim calendar. Okay, I see the significance. Go ahead, please.
All right, so originally there were Jewish communities, significant ones there. They were well established. They had trade relations with the local Arab tribes. They were, this is pre-Islam. This is pre-being a Muslim at this point.
Yeah.
So Muhammad tried to settle some of these disputes among the many different...
I'm sorry, when you say, Professor Pytlik, when you say pre-Islam, you mean pre-Medina being a Muslim town? Okay.
We have to...
Muhammad himself was a Muslim by then.
It's hard to know exactly what he would have called himself. Was he was he a Muslim at that point? It's the same question we have within Judaism. Who's the first Jew? I mean, there's no such thing as Judaism or the Torah in the time of Abraham, but he's considered the first Jew. It's just how you kind of slice it a little bit. Okay. It's not a big deal. There was heavy fighting there, and he and his group, his men, eventually won. And it was with a goal to stamp out the tribal wars and establish a new social order. So this is a religious effort and also a political one. So Mecca and Medina are both important cities for Muhammad's journey and the events of his life. So Jerusalem also stands as the third most important. But at the time, the direction of prayer, as I said, the Qibla, or the direction of prayer was originally towards Mecca before his flight to Medina, but it was also towards Jerusalem. So there's a time within the sort of the rituals, how the rituals were developed, how are they developed? And it takes time. We can trace this in Judaism too, to an extent, how the new religion will make new statements about its customs and its rituals. In other words, Jerusalem becomes not the final place of the direction of prayer. It's Mecca eventually. And the Sabbath, when do you have a Sabbath? Well, the Sabbath idea within Islam is different than, say, Christianity or Judaism.
It's Friday.
Saturday is taken already. Sunday.
Yeah.
So they eventually worked it in to be Friday, but even here it's different because it's a day intoned with importance, extra prayers, for example, longer prayers, and a political statement in the sermons on Friday, as it is to this day, tied together. But it's not a full day of rest. So it's not the same. The ideas are not quite the same. So there's an eventual divergence from Jewish practices to make Islam, and
a religion on its own. You mentioned several times how Islam recognizes previous prophets, Moses, Jesus, David, Solomon. Is Moses mentioned in the Quran?
Yes, he is. I'm not an expert on the Quran. I pick and choose where I need to there, but yes, he is mentioned. It's a very important prophet.
Interesting.
So Christianity had to do the same sort of thing with Judaism, because when Christianity comes, yes, it has radically new ideas, but it also has this split from Judaism. And the real split takes several centuries to occur to make it a new religion. The idea of the person of Jesus. Who is Jesus? That is much different than it's the big divergence with Judaism. But this is how very interesting how when the Dome of the Rock is built in Jerusalem for under the Umayyads, for example, it's built about 691 AD. This is a new statement. This is a new statement about not only power but religious understanding. We accept, I think I'm putting words in their mouth, we accept the past, the effective rulers of David and Solomon, but also here's a new dispensation. What's really interesting is the inscriptions that are on the Dome of the Rock, because they are really speaking to the Christian community, which was the majority of the people in Jerusalem at that time.
Interesting. Why don't we take a short break and talk about what happens after Muhammad? And you already alluded to it. We'll be back in a moment. This episode is brought to you by Anchor.fm. Do you have an opinion, that is screaming to be heard? Have you got a story that is biding its time to be told? It could be your professional expertise, or it could be something more, such as the kernel of your life experiences. So share it. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to start your own podcast. It's easy. Anchor is free and it's got everything for you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. And there's no minimum audience requirement to monetize your podcast. People want to hear your story, your opinion, so share it with them through your own Anchor podcast. So, Professor Pytlik, you mentioned that there's the growth of Christianity. In this case, Muslims, they don't grow eventually. Essentially, they just explode out of the Arabian Peninsula. And within a very short period, they conquer vast territories from India through the Middle East and North Africa and in Spain to the borders of France. As you were teaching me, narrating this history of early Islam and Jews, it occurred to me that Jewish people lived in these lands, and you know their previous governments were Christian or Zoroastrian or what have you. So what happens when the governments are now Muslim? What happens to the Jewish people in these lands?
Well, there's no one heir after Muhammad. The succession after him is problematic. We end up with different factions, and this becomes its own issue within Muslim history or Islamic
Shiaism and yeah.
So
Shias and Sunnis.
What ends up happening is that we have different groups, different ruling bodies, and in the area of Palestine at the time, it's conquered in 638 by these tribes, and eventually the Umayyad dynasty will control this area. So here you
mentioned the Dome of the Rock in a previous segment, yeah.
Right. So what do they inherit? What they inherit from conquer. They take the keys of the city of Jerusalem from the Byzantines, and that's the Christian group.
The Byzantine being Eastern Roman Empire.
Correct. And so here they have a number of issues. Jerusalem is an important city. The night flight story is known at this point, but it's really solidified a little bit later about the actual mystical journey, but it's still there. It takes a while for it to filter down into an actual story and be written down. But the Umayyads are controlling Palestine, part of Syria, maybe a little bit part of Jordan as well as we know it today. And eventually they set up a new political capital. So there's already competition there for Mecca and Medina. Jerusalem becomes the new capital. And what's important here is that these older dispensation stories are there. The Dome of the Rock is built over the place of the former Jewish temples, the two Jewish temples that existed in history. And also the stories are starting to be incorporated. So again, what happens to Jews at this point?
Wait, is there any destruction or desecration of Jewish holy sites?
At this point, the as far as we know, the Temple Mount had been left sort of in ruins. There's some stories and some writings about Christian leaders who wanted to keep that Temple Mount sort of as a reminder of the failed religion of Judaism, whereas the Holy Sepulchre, which is not very far away, is the new place for the Holy Christianity. So it's a little unclear what was there, but it's cleaned off. The Temple Mount is cleaned off, and the dome is erected there.
I see.
So what had happened before that, though, is that in many cases, and sometimes a little less and a little more so, it depends on historical times, Jews were barred from Jerusalem. Well, that's reversed, and Jews can come back. There's no such thing as a tradition at this point of the Western Wall. It's more of like where the temple used to stand. So Jews are allowed to come back and visit these places and pray.
That's a big deal.
It is a big deal. I don't mean to come off here in the rest of the time we're together is to say that everything was perfect. It's not perfect.
No.
But There are some really progressive things that occur, and that is that the Muslim authorities realize they inherit a really mixed bag of people with different traditions, different histories, different ideas, and so there is an attempt to sort of codify protections. And this can be looked at in a few examples. The dhimmi status. The dhimmi means a protected class, non-Muslim. So Christians, let's say, and Jews for the most part, are provided some protections. They have to pay a head tax, a jizya tax, and they pay that. And then other things are good here in some cases. They don't have to, for example, go into the army. They are restricted in some other ways. They can't build synagogues or churches higher than a mosque or something like this. So there are some restrictions, but there are also some protections. So if we're talking about 7th and 8th and 9th century Middle East, this is pretty advanced an idea.
So you're in comparison to the past, this is pretty advanced.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a huge empire, as you said. It extends all the way from North Africa to India, for example. There are a number of other groups that come and go within Muslim history. For example, Baghdad is founded as a new city in 762 under the Abbasids, and Jews are already living there, and they are flourishing there. Now, this is not a town at this point anyway that becomes Christian at all. So Jews and Muslims got on quite well together. And this is an example for the Near East versus Christian Europe, where Jews had a much different experience, a much worse experience overall.
When we talk about Baghdad, and we go west, let's say towards Spain, were there different kingdoms? Were there different treatments in the Muslim world? Did the Muslim world splinter at some point?
There is some splintering, and there are different empires. There are Mamluks, there are Abbasids, there are Seljuks, there are all kinds of different groups, but we're talking about a long period of time as well.
Yeah.
So is it uniform across? Not always, but in general, just to make the statement again, Jews fare much better, and this is the thing we need to remember. Jews fare much better under Muslim rule than they ever did under Christian rule. And I think that there's a number of reasons for that. Number one, they lived close by. They participated in the same sorts of economic activities. They traded stories about their common religious roots, for example. As far as the scholarship goes, in Baghdad, it's a flourishing center of Jewish learning, right alongside the same sort of center of Islamic, of Muslim learning. So what are they doing? They're speaking same languages. Many of the earliest texts that we have in Judaism about theology are in Arabic because they're speaking to each other. And that there's a bit of a tagline. It doesn't always mean this, but when you're speaking about mysticism and you're speaking about writing and having conferences about theological ideas, it's more or less has to be sort of in a period of peace and trust that you can have these conversations without being fearful. For example, in Europe, where this goes on, there are disputations, they're called.
Yeah.
And if a Jew were to lose these, they were kicked out of the country, for example. The Talmud, for example, in Europe, in many places, Paris and other places, was burned, put on trial and burned as a text. This doesn't occur in Muslim lands.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. In Christendom, they had these disputations. If the Jewish scholars lost that debate, they would be kicked out of the country. There would be some punishment.
Not only that, sometimes if they won the debate, they were kicked out. The most famous disputation was in 1263. We have a very famous Jewish scholar, Rabbi Nachmanides, in 1263. He's put on this disputation. It was organized by the leadership of the province at the time, the kingdom of the time. And against him is a scholar who was Jewish, converted to Christianity, and he is going to debate the Jewish scholar. And some of the topics include the nature of Jesus. Had the Messiah already come? These big ideas within theology at the time. So there's a trial. It's a show trial. And Nachmanides is incredible. He presents the case without being offensive in any way. And the king declares that he won the debate and he's paid the prize money, whatever it was. And yet at the same time, he still has to go. So where does he go? 1263, he picks up. Now remember, 1263, around this time, we're still in the pretty heated phases of the Crusades.
Yes.
He goes to Jerusalem. And there he founds a synagogue. He writes letters back to Europe and he tells people, hey, you might need to come here because things don't look so great.
Oh wow. Way back in 1263, it's come to the lands of Muslims because relatively speaking, it's better here. And I think
that even further than that, people go on pilgrimages. This is a pillar within Islam. This is, something that people have done for centuries and centuries. Millennia, actually, and they go on pilgrimages. It's really fascinating.
I'm sorry, who actually? You said
people like to go on pilgrimage.
Okay.
Muslims, Jews, Christians.
Okay.
So what's interesting is the writings from we have some from the 4th century. We have a number through the Middle Ages at the height of the Crusades. Jews and Christians, of course, too, but Jews are picking up and leaving Europe and going to Baghdad, and they're going to Cairo, and they're going to Palestine, of course, and they're looking at all these places. And what's interesting is you don't hear about really any big blockages. They partner with Muslim locals to help them move from place to place. The worst that I've seen, and I know there are other records, I haven't read all of them, but it's interesting because some Jewish pilgrims will say, well, you got to be careful when you get to the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron, because if you don't pay the right sort of bribe, you're not going to see the good stuff. You got to watch the guide. You got to watch the guides today, too.
You see how fascinating it is to most of us who are not familiar with this history. More modern 20th century and now Western Europe and North America are places of refuge for minorities, including Jews, and of course there's Israel. Two small questions. I say small because in the context of everything you've discussed, they matter probably a little less. You said they lived close to each other. Were there ghettos in the Muslim world the way they developed in later centuries? Did Jews have quarters, or did they just sort of intermingled like they do here in America? Everyone just lives interdispersed amongst each other.
There is also not the same. The ghetto idea, the actual ghetto, comes from France, 1516, somewhere in there.
France, okay.
Venice, sorry.
Oh, Venice, I apologize. Venice, okay.
So that is meant to wall Jews in, while at the same time they're providing some economic benefits to the Venetian society. There is that, but they're sort of walled in to keep them separate. Now, there are examples where, here's the difference though. For example, in 1516, the Ottomans take control of Palestine. And just before that, in 1492, the massive expulsion of Jews from Spain. But this is just the biggest of a number of them in the 1200s and the 1100s, the 1300s. And
is this after Ferdinand and Isabel win against Muslims in Granada?
Numerous expulsions that occurred all over Europe. Jews are kicked out. And then in 1492, with the stroke of a pen, the Jews are expelled from Spain. Had been there for 600 years and got along just great with the Islamic culture that preceded it in Spain, preceded the Reconquista in Spain. And a beautiful society developed. It's called Andalusia. And his beautiful Spanish culture, Jewish
in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain.
This whole thing for good 600 years or so. Jews are expelled in 1492. Where do they go? They go to Venice. They go to Amsterdam because it's a freer city. And a number of them, a good portion of them, go to where? The Ottoman Empire. And where did they go? Why did they go? We have a number of stories, and I have no reason to doubt these are historical. Bayezid II sent out his navy, his Ottoman.
Was a sultan of the Ottomans.
Yes.
Okay.
Under the command of his admiral, and he sent them to Spain in 1492 in order to evacuate Jews safely to Ottoman lands. He sent out proclamations throughout the empire that the refugees should be welcomed. And he granted these refugees permission to settle in the Ottoman Empire and become Ottoman citizens. And he ridiculed the Spanish leaders who kicked out the Jews, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. He said this, quote, "You venture to call Ferdinand a wise ruler?" he said to his courtiers. "He who has impoverished his own country has enriched mine." There's another example of this that said, European loss is our gain. Now, what's the gain here? Jews thrived. They knew languages. They knew how to play intermediaries between European trade and Near Eastern trade, which was thriving at the time. They knew how to speak the languages of Muslims and European people as well. One case study, Safed in the north of modern-day Israel, then Palestine. It's
Safed. Does that have to do with Sephardic, or am I just conflating those names?
Yeah, it's a separate thing.
Okay, go ahead.
Hebrew, it's Tzfat, but we say Safed. Beautiful mystical city. It's the city of the Kabbalah, which had flourished in Europe. It flourishes even more in Palestine. And there, Jews come because there's already a long history of Jews and their scholars and the sages of the Talmud living in Safed and in this area for centuries. And people are coming here to be close to that activity, as well as the intellectual activity that is flourishing there. You don't have flourishing intellectual activity and prosperity without peace. So here's another example of how things are different. When the Jews settle here in this town, I'm really only speaking of this town right now, they come with a specific sort of talent, which is to help the process of fulling wool and dyeing wool that they learned in Europe, brought to the Ottoman Empire. And so and the proliferation of water in this particular place allows for this processing of this wool, which then goes on to Syria and Damascus and all these other places, Syria and Baghdad and so on. And there are protections put for Jews. A wall is erected around them with a different intention, not to keep them in, but to protect the industry from people from the outsides.
Oh, I see.
Taxes are lowered and eliminated in some cases for Jews to come here. And what are they allowed to do? This is technically after the monumental earthquake of the Spanish expulsion. Jewish legal religious authority in the land of Israel, as it was known, or in Palestine, had broken down completely because of centuries of neglect and Jews hardly living there. There were Jews, but there were no rabbis there at that point. They had to reinvent Judaism. This is one of those pivot points in Jewish history, where if it weren't for the conditions here, the protections here, Judaism might have disappeared. This is a really important part of the whole story. And the Ottomans created this. The Ottomans were also progressive in a sense. They created pacts, or they called capitulations, with European countries that protected the rights of the people in both places. For example, the Ottomans go into a trade agreement with Venice. The Ottomans insisted as part of that trade agreement that the people within Venice, such as Jews, and the people on the Ottoman side would be protected rights for the first time.
Professor Pytlik, I want to make sure that I understand this correctly. When you say Ottomans, we're talking about early to mid dynasty Ottomans. We're talking the first 300s, right? Yeah. The phrase, I hope I'm saying it correctly, the sick man of Europe that was attributed to Ottomans, that comes much later, and that sullies the relationship between Ottomans and their Jewish subjects, right?
Right. So that is a good point. And so when the Ottoman Empire takes over as Istanbul or Constantinople in 1453. We go until the latter part of the 16th century when things are pretty good and the empire is run efficiently. After that, things changed somewhat, as you said.
We'll be back after a short break and talk more about the long history of Muslims and Jews. I hope you're enjoying this podcast. And if you are, then why not treat us to a cup of coffee? That's right. For the price of a cup of coffee, you too can become a monthly supporter of the PL.News podcast. And it's easy. Just click the support link in the detailed caption of this episode. Professor Pytlik, I've read in many different publications, including your own, about this crossover or collaboration in the realm of Sufism between Muslims and the counterpart of that in Judaism. It's so fascinating. I'd love to learn a little bit about that.
This is a particular interest of mine, and I want to make sure I also give due honor to all three religions, because when it comes to mystical ideas, they are speaking similar language. And so I want to make sure we include, if we don't even talk about it that much, include the fact that Christianity in the 12th and 13th century was flourishing with these mystical ideas. We have beautiful, incredible writings. Islamic scholars, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and others, of course, there are wonderful scholars about this. And Jews proliferate with this idea of Kabbalah and mysticism. Kabbalah comes officially a bit later in time, but already in the Hebrew Bible, we have examples of mysticism, and it goes and goes and goes centuries after century. So
is Kabbalah the name that's similar to Sufism when it comes to Judaism? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, I think we should just use the generic term mystical trends within within each religion. And they speak common language. They speak of symbols. And a lot of these symbols we could trace back as early as the Greeks. Islamic culture brought a lot of these things back to life and brought them into the discussion, like Islamic, the cosmology and the idea of seven heavens populates into Christianity and to a different extent into Judaism. So we have a number of these mystical trends and important, significant writings and places. Like, for example, for Judaism, Kabbalah, the received tradition, Kabbalah, begins early, and it starts in southern France and in Spain. Even European writers are writing in Arabic, like Maimonides, the important scholar. He eventually goes to Cairo, and there he becomes the physician to the vizier. And he is talking about Sufism, and he gives it high marks. Now, Maimonides is known as a legal scholar, a rationalist, but even here he says Sufism is like Judaism in a sense. So they're speaking these great conversations that transcend, the normal sort of problems and differences. They speak to commonalities. So there's this really rich cross-religious intellectual development. And we see this in a number of writings. And we see this also in the fact that some Sufis and some Kabbalistic Jews or mystical Jews were sitting together and discussing these things. It's a fantastic place that we need to remember, even with Christians, of course, with Christians, that there are these common ideas that populate our religions. One of the horrible things about that we see in common society today, or popular society today, writ large, is the fact that organized religion is really trashed, and it's really given a bad name. But I think that what we have not done well is to teach some of these things that show us the commonalities and also the richness, the spiritual richness that's there.
People also give a message of hope that we've got along in the past, and one of those messages of hope comes from not just religious materials. It comes from a particular place, and it comes from Cairo, where Jews had a flourishing life among Muslims in Cairo.
And I'm talking about the synagogue there, the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, Old Fustat as it was called, and the Geniza has been found in the late 1800s.
What is a Geniza?
Geniza is a repository, a place for proper disposal of Jewish texts, usually where the name of God is written, the holy name of God is written in Hebrew, or say, for example, a prayer book is ripped, page comes out, it goes to a geniza, which is a place for proper burial, really. Sometimes it's in a synagogue, it's in the floor, sometimes, or in a chest in the floor, something like this. In other words, that there is a long tradition about the sacred nature of the text.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And these are properly buried. This goes back all the way, we think, to Masada in the 1st century. We have some of these examples. So this is quite old.
Wow.
And so Cairo is one
of these. So you don't just throw it out. There's a ritual for this.
You don't throw it in the recycling bin. You really properly.
Got it.
And so this Geniza in this old synagogue, which has been even destroyed a few times itself over the years and rebuilt, but from around the 9th century all the way up to the 18th century, there is 18 feet I think it's by 6 by 3. It's a big column of space. And here, this community put not only those kinds of texts with religious connotations, but also marriage contracts. And they put school child sort of practice texts of writing his or her ABCs. And they put those there. Poetry, checks, like physical checks for
how long were these things deposited in there?
There's about 900 years of this material.
Gosh, that's history.
This is the richest history that we have about daily life with Jews and Muslims. It's nicknamed the Second Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's got more detail because it's talking about women who own businesses who are taking other.
Wait, women own businesses back then in Muslim land, and these are Jewish women.
Yes, but they're interacting with others. So if there's a lawsuit with a Jew and someone else, it goes to court. They tell us about it. Women are widowed, and then they take over a business. They inherit property. They dispense of that property to their heirs. This is all written down. So it gives us a really unique view of life in the Middle East. Now, is it perfect again? No, it's not perfect. But what kind of jobs could Jews do? From the Cairo Geniza, we learned that there are something like 450 unique kinds of jobs Jews were involved in trade, in selling trinkets, and whatever, law, whatever it happened to be, physicians. You compare that to Europe, and in some places it's like that, and sometimes in places, but in most other cases, European Jewry was continuously restricted in what they could do. So we have
when we talk about jobs, did Jews ever become, under Islam, ascend to the higher echelons of the government? How high are we talking about? Is that
we have look at Maimonides himself, physician to the visitor.
Oh yeah, okay.
We have a number of different professional positions, such as official government, accountants, and sort of assistants to the rulers and military leaders. Yes, it does.
Military. It's changed so much. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So the Geniza gives us this beautiful, rich tapestry of life. Solomon Schechter received little bits of this information from some Scottish travelers, 2 sisters who traveled in the Near East and were very interested themselves and self-taught about ancient languages. So they recognized there was something unique about a piece they bought in the Cairo marketplace, and they took it back to London, and they got a hold of it.
They took it back to London. You're telling me this is 18 feet deep? This is like a grain silo, almost like a small. How did wow?
Some of these texts filtered out over the years and ended up on what we would consider to be the tourist trade. They ended up in marketplaces. Probably the sellers didn't know what it was. But these 2 women were keen to understand what these texts might be. So they bought the text, little pieces, little trinkets, and they took it back. Schechter said, this is a rare text, a very early text of Ecclesiasticus. And he said, where did you find these ladies? And he eventually goes back. And what's also interesting is he eventually takes back trunk loads
Yeah.
of this material and takes it back to London. So we have hundreds of thousands of pieces of material that talk about just life, beautiful poetry, and
You could
love poetry,
you could do your
song.
PhD on those papers.
Oh, for sure, for sure. So this has opened up our eyes about the fact that there was this rich, flourishing tradition among these two groups, and there were restrictions put on Jews even in Muslim lands, of course.
Of
But
course.
it's really interesting, through the Cairo Geniza, they find ways to get around it, and oftentimes they weren't enforced. So it's really you have to look. It depends where and when about this love affair, because it doesn't last forever.
Of course. Yeah. Here we are. Yeah, of course. Professor Pytlik, let's take a break. Stay with me and Professor Pytlik as we get into the perspective. Professor Pytlik, we covered all this history, and as I told you during the break, you really opened my eyes to the past. So I guess the question I have for our perspective is, are there any lessons for us now in 2021 and going forward?
I for sure. I think we need to remember what we forgot. That's the message.
Remember what we forgot. Okay.
I want to remember. I want us to remember what was possible. Now, we have now talked about the modern political issues that plague the Near East, with the establishment of the State of Israel and all of the faux pas that were created during that whole process and before that process, and the fact that we have, and the understanding that we have people suffering, and I'm talking about in the Palestinian territories and other places. This is not really what we're talking about today. It is completely complicated and something else others can talk about, whoever.
Exactly.
What's specific. But what we should remember is, I want to bring a short passage that is not necessarily about Muslim Jewish relations, but it is from the Jewish tradition, and it's about where we are today. Insofar as we have forgotten some of the wonderful spiritual messages about within each of these traditions, without being overtly religious, we have forgotten what we once knew. So I want to read this story. I'll translate.
Where is this from? What is from the Torah, or?
No, this is from a story.
Okay.
Sort of a story.
Okay.
Now, it's set in 18th century, let's say.
Okay.
Now, I will read this and I'll translate the names. So it starts like this. When the Baal Shem Tov is master of the good name. He's sort of the founder of modern Hasidism within Judaism, a mystical sort of group. Okay, when he's the great Baal Shem Tov. When he was challenged by a seemingly insurmountable task, he would go to a certain place in the forest, light a fire, and meditate in prayer. And what he had set out to perform would become accomplished. A generation later, when the great sage of Mezerich encountered a similar challenge, he would journey to the same place in the forest and he would say, "We can no longer light the fire, but we can recite the same prayers." And what he wanted to be done was accomplished. In the next generation, Moses of the town of Sassov went to that very spot in the forest and said, "We can no longer know how to light the fire. We no longer know the correct meditations on the prayers, but we still know the place in the forest to which it belongs, and that must be enough." Finally, in the following generation, when Rabbi Israel of the town of Ryzen was called upon to perform the task, he sat in his home and he said, "We cannot light the fire, nor can we recite the prayers. We don't even know the location of the place. All we can do is retell the tale of how it was done, and that must be enough for us." So what I want to bring by that story is that we have this rich tradition and we need to remember it. And by remembering it and by bringing it forward, maybe there's a way to do some repair. What can we talk about that transcends some of these problems without at the same time ignoring those problems? So when I was asked, I was just in Sedona hiking for a week, just last week. And of course,
I was there 3 weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah.
With the idea, with the Gaza situation and the bombing and all this stuff going on, I got a call from Oakland University, and they said, "Well, we have this opportunity on WXYZ TV in Detroit. They want to interview someone about this Palestinian-Israeli situation. Can you do an interview?" And I'm like, "I'm hiking in the middle of the desert here." So as it turns out, I got on, and they wanted to know what can we do. And that's the problem. What do we do? Because today they said, what is the religious reasons why these two are fighting? And today I can't say they're fighting over religious reasons. I just don't see it that way.
That's the sense I got when I was listening to Palestinians and Israelis talk on the social media app I told you about, Clubhouse. This is not about Jews or Muslims. And this is not my opinion. I'm sharing with you what I heard. This is about current conflicts that will hopefully one day be resolved.
Well, look at what the Abraham Accord says. Now, when you look at the text, it's quite simple. The Abraham Accord is an attempt to sort of set the stage for how we begin to talk to each other. And it starts like this. We, the undersigned, recognize the importance of maintaining and strengthening peace in the Middle East and around the world based on mutual understanding and coexistence, as well as a respect for human dignity and freedom, including religious freedom. We encourage efforts to promote interfaith and intercultural dialogue to advance a culture of peace among the three Abrahamic religions and all humanity, and so on and so on. And in a sense here, what it's indicating is, let's remember what we forgot.
Exactly. Well, let's hope for a peaceful future in the Middle East and some sort of resolution to all these conflicts that we have. And let's remember what we forgot. That's really the lesson, the mantra from this episode. Professor Pytlik, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. You're welcome back to the PL.News, of course, anytime. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. The opinions and statements of our guests are their own. We neither agree nor disagree with them. We're only interested in the perspective they provide through history. At the PL.News, we're honored that our guests share their expertise with us, most of which are based on years of scholarship and research. And we provide links to their projects and publications for your benefit, to review them if you wish. Otherwise, we're not affiliated with our guests. We just think they teach us pretty cool history, the history behind our news. Also, unless we explicitly inform you, we're not affiliated with any institutions, including Amazon, for which book links are shared here from time to time for your convenience. Finally, as a reminder, we don't do news here at the PL.News. We peel the news for the history behind it. And our mission is not to provide a complete account and analysis of the past, rather is to highlight some issues and incidents in our history that may poke and prod your discerning minds into seeking some perspective for our current events. And if you disagree with our take on history, well then, it means we've succeeded in getting you to think about the history behind news. And of course, share your thoughts with me by leaving comments about this episode on our Instagram page at the PL.News. I love to hear from you. I love to learn from you. Until next time, this is Adele with a PL.News.